Your investment property has underground fuel tank. All right, guys, we are going to talk all about fuel tanks underground on a property you're thinking to purchase. If you haven't heard of this before, it happens quite a bit in the Midwest and in the East Coast. And basically what happened is underground fuel tanks, which were typically oil tanks, and this is how houses were heated. Now, most of that has become obsolete as we work with natural gas these days, and furnaces are on natural gas, but occasionally you'll find a tank. Lots of times those tanks were above the ground, but some of them were buried below the ground. Now, I need to make a distinction here to make sure we're on the same page here. We're not talking about a commercial property where you've got environmental issues, where you've got to do like an environmental study. If you're buying a place that maybe was a gas station and there was fuel tanks on that. What I'm talking about is single family houses, or maybe up to a fourplex where there was some type of a tank on there, which, like I said, is typically an oil tank, which was heating the house or having some type of fuel for the house. Now, these things have, for the most part, became obsolete. Now, occasionally I run into a situation where there's a tank and they're dealing with propane. This is typically more rural properties where there's propane, and that propane tank is what actually fuels the house. That's a little bit more common as you're dealing with rural areas, but a little less is when you're dealing with these oil tanks. Now, this can be a problem, guys. One of the reasons is those tanks, first off, you need to understand what the size of the tank is. Next, you need to really understand like what was the tank used for, because there could be some leaching into the ground and that could cause some issues. You may have to have that professionally removed, and you might have to have an environmental company that's helping you get that removal. So it's something you really need to be aware of. This is something I highly recommend during the due diligence period that you find out about if there was any tanks or anything like that. And if there is, you need to make sure you get a professional in there to check it out and tell you, can it just be left there? Does it need to be removed? Is there concerns with it leaking? And if it is what is fueling the house, I think you need to be a little bit concerned about that as well, because with natural gas and those things, in a lot of places, you'd much rather have natural gas than have an oil tank that's sitting in the back of your house. The other thing I say quite frequently is make sure you understand what is happening in the area. Like we talked about some propane. If a propane tank is common in the area, which is typically more rural properties, then that's okay as long as that's what your comparables have. But if your comparables don't have that and yours does, that's a really big concern. Because when you're dealing with reselling a property, you want to make sure that yours is very similar to everything that's out there. And if it's something that's weird, that's a problem. And one of the things that's really hard to do is put a value on weird. How much are you going to lose if something's weird? For example, if you've got a fuel tank and nobody else has a fuel tank, how much less would you get than the other comparable properties? And that's really hard to make a determination on. It's easy to be like, oh, for 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, you name the number less, it would really make sense for somebody. But that's not always the case, especially if you look into what it's going to cost to remove it and those things. So I want to make sure that the property that you're dealing with is like similar properties, which means one of two things. Either you're going to have to get that tank removed if none of the other properties have tanks and they're all using natural gas. Number two, you may have to get natural gas attached to the property, and there's going to be some expense in doing that if it's not already. Now, if there is natural gas to the property and you still have a tank, you've got to look at the environmental issue and take into consideration of removing that, and look at the pros and cons of doing that and what that will have an impact on your resellability on the property. It really just comes down to taking the least amount of risk. If you're leaving something like a fuel tank and nobody else has those, you're taking some risk in reselling that property, because there may be somebody that's concerned about that, which is going to lower the value of what you're going to be able to get. How much? I don't really know. That's one of the difficult things. And so for me, it's understanding if there's a fuel tank. If there is, what was in that fuel tank? What was the size of it? What was it used for? What is it currently used to heat the property? If not, we need to upgrade that. Do we need to look at getting rid of the tank? And in most cases, that's going to be the simplest, unless you get some professional advice that leaving it's going to be okay. But you want to make sure that's pretty common in the area, just like everything else that is out there. So that's some of the things you've really got to look at. Personally, I'm not in love with seeing a fuel tank on a property. It gives me the EPA-Jeebies a little bit, just because I don't know what to expect or what to deal with. Because the last thing you want to do is have the EPA come knocking on your door saying this thing's been leaking everywhere and you've got to spend all this money to clean up the property and clean up the area and those types of things. So it's just one more thing to worry about. But again, local knowledge is what's really important with this. making sure you've got a good contractor that specifically deals with this. And that's one of the mistakes I see a lot of people make, is they just get an average contractor, not somebody that specifically works on fuel tanks or specifically deals with these type of issues, and they say, oh, we'll just rip it out of there. And then in the middle of them ripping it out of there, neighbor calls somebody and they come by and they put a red tag on it, and all of a sudden you've got a big EPA issue that you've got to deal with that can be very expensive, that's much more than what you may have budgeted for. So for my advice is find out ahead of time so you don't have to deal with those types of issues. Now, if you decide that you want to move forward with purchasing a property, whether it's got an underground tank or not, I can teach you how to get your deals funded without using any of your own money. I cover 17 ways to do that in one of my most popular videos. So you can click to watch that right now, the 17 ways to get a deal done without little to no money out of your own pocket. Thanks a lot, and make it a very profitable day. Check out that video.